With the remainder of our time, I wanted to go through a couple examples of CLI documentation from the main product that I work on, IBM Cloud Kubernetes Service. I'll talk about installation guides, the motivation for the different topics in our CLI documentation, an example of a topic that uses the CLI, some reference docs, a quick tour of our CLI, and a bonus extension. If you're ready, let's begin. So here we have the doc set for the IBM Cloud CLI. Scrolling through the How-To section, you can see that you can install the tool, extend it with plugins, and then do stuff with it like deploy and debug apps. There's also a reference section that includes reference docs for many plugins, of which my product is one. The release notes are done automatically through GitHub, and there are some extra goodies like the quick reference printout, a perennial favorite job aid in the tech development world. If we go to my product, IBM Cloud Kubernetes Service, we can find a how-to page for installing the CLI. Let's see if we can follow along with this topic. It installs the main IBM Cloud CLI, as well as several plugins that you use with it to manage Kubernetes clusters and deploy containerized apps to these clusters. The first step links us back to the main IBM Cloud doc. Linking out isn't a great doc experience, but we did this for a couple reasons. One, we didn't want to have to maintain it when the IBM Cloud CLI tool changed how it gets installed. And two, our core team asked all the plugins to link back to their docs. So if we go to the main topic, we see some prerequisites like setting up an account. Unfortunately, this is where many casual users would fall away, but that's okay for our product because it's an enterprise B2B, B2G type product. If you have a broader commercial consumer B2C or open source product, consider not making them have an account. After the prereqs are some instructions to use a script that installs the CLI and plugins automatically depending on your operating system. So once we've done that, we can return to my doc, and the remaining steps are about confirming that you can log in and checking that the plugins are installed. For what's next, we link out to the reference pages for the IBM Cloud CLI and relevant plugins so that they don't have to wonder which ones matter from the many that are available. Looking at some more topics on this page, we see one to install a separate Kubernetes CLI, kubectl, which is an open source project that our IBM Cloud product uses. Again, we see things like operating system specific steps where we guide users step by step to downloading the binary files, making them an executable file, and putting them on the path. Many projects skip these and just assume people know, but if you can take a few minutes up front to test them out yourself and provide a guided experience, it makes it that much easier for users. While I don't love how wordy this topic is, I do like that it includes context for things to consider. Like if you run this CLI at a different version than the cluster it's connected to, errors might happen. Finally, it provides some suggestions for what to do next, such as enabling autocomplete or creating a cluster via the CLI. We have some other topics on this page, like updating or uninstalling the CLI, but one that I want to look at is using the IBM Cloud Shell in your web browser, a beta that we recently released platform-wide. If you have an IBM Cloud account, users can log in and use the shell right from the web browser instead of needing to set up their local machine with the right binary files and whatnot. This can be very convenient when people just want to quickly do a couple small things in the CLI as part of a larger GUI-based experience. So we can see the terminal preparing a session for us. I can run the same commands as I could locally, except I didn't have to do any of the installation. I can just list my clusters, set the context to a cluster, and use kubectl to view the pods that my apps are running in the cluster all from here. The doc covers some of the limitations or differences from a regular local experience, such as the information not persisting across sessions, or that you can't download things from the shell because there's nowhere to download them to. Moving on to how we use CLI commands in our regular product documentation, one of the main things that people do in our product is to create a group of remote servers called a cluster where they can deploy applications. Going to our Creating a Cluster page, one of the first things that we see is a sample commands topic. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to copy-paste these examples for when they're already familiar with what they need to do, but they just need a reminder. So if I copy this and paste it into my IBM Cloud Shell, we'll see a free cluster gets created. And there it is, deploying. If we look a little further on this page, we'll see creating a standard classic cluster in the CLI topic. And true to form, it has lots of CLI commands. We're providing a lot of context for each step along the way because this is an important topic for the user to get right. I know it's long, but we have shorter, funner tutorials and getting started pages elsewhere. Whereas this is a meatier version for developers who are going to build their scripts off the CLI, so they need to know what's happening and how to get the right information. So for example, here's a table that explains each flag in the cluster create command in detail. Even though it's long and certainly not perfect, we've actually gotten a lot of praise for this table format because it is clear and comprehensive, and also easy for people to Control F a keyword and find it on the page. Our docs often use CLI commands throughout, but sometimes we offer alternative ways such as via the API or GUI. For example, here's that same CLI topic, except for the IBM Cloud Console. Because this topic is so long, we didn't combine them. At other times, however, such as in this topic, we have a tab table where people can flip between CLI and GUI or other types of steps. This is still a work in progress, and you can Google other docs to see similar and maybe prettier ways to display this type of information. But it's all about giving developers choices for how they want to interact with your product to accomplish their goal. How do you know what sorts of things to document in the GUI versus the CLI? I'll give a shout out to Micah and Spencer, designers on my team, who wrote a great in-depth Medium blog post about this very topic that can help you figure this out. So, we've looked at CLI docs in action, like installation and task-based topics. But there is another type of CLI doc that your users might want, reference materials. I wanted to show you two types of reference materials, a CLI reference page and changelogs. I also want to show you two different approaches towards each type. For the IBM Cloud Kubernetes Service CLI reference page, we have some initial upfront matter about what versions do they want to use. Remember, I said we had redesigned the CLI a couple times, so this topic compares what they get in each version. We also have a comparison topic because our product itself has different versions called Classic and VPC, so it compares what types of commands you can do in which version of the product. We also have the CLI image map with all our commands visually depicted, as we talked about earlier, to help people see what is possible. And then we have the commands themselves. Each command follows a template with the following features: the name of the command, like IBM Cloud KS Cluster Add-on Disable Debug Tool, a description of what the command does, a copyable skeleton command, the supported infrastructure providers, those different versions of the product I mentioned previously, Classic and VPC, the minimum permissions you need to run the command, and a description of each command option. Occasionally, the CLI topics will also have instructions in them, such as IBM Cloud KS Worker Reboot command, that might walk users through things they should do before and after they use the command, because it could impact their environment. For example, when you reboot a worker node machine, if you didn't properly close the apps running on it, the drain command mentioned here, you might get errors, so we want to help users prevent this. The open source Kubernetes project that our IBM Cloud One is related to also has a CLI reference doc set, focusing specifically on the Kubernetes functionality in its standalone CLI kubecontrol. Their approach is an interesting blend of task-based doc and reference material. We can see from the navigation that they group their pages into categories that are focused on things that developers might do, instead of an alphabetical reference list. For example, app management or resource printing. Then, each page describes some things that you might do to achieve this goal. For example, summaries shows various ways to summarize your resources, such as using a get command, looking at the default columns of information that is returned no matter what resource you get, and other options like wide, custom columns, or labels. Which approach you take depends on a few factors, such as what you can maintain. Since our product already has an extensive task-based doc set, we just wanted a single CLI reference page that people could Control F and find what they're looking for, with consistent information for each command. Kubernetes wanted a more comprehensive doc set focused exclusively on the CLI to teach users and other companies that integrate with them how to make the most out of the CLI, separate from their product docs. IBM Cloud Kubernetes Service CLI docs also include a simple changelog page that is basically a table with each release version and a summary of changes. Because ours is a plugin to the larger IBM Cloud CLI and does not have its own GitHub repo, we put the changelog page in our docs. The main IBM Cloud CLI, however, has a public GitHub repo and uses the releases capability to store each release. Here, users can download a zip file for the binary files by operating system and review the major changes since the previous version. We saw little in the IBM Cloud Shell demo, but I wanted to return to the IBM Cloud KS CLI to recap a few doc lessons. First, the CLI includes a help grouping of the commands, and each command includes a description that hopefully follows the best practices we talked about earlier. What I want to do now is run a few commands wrong to show how the errors are displayed. As you can see, it returns failed, but also tells you why. In this case, I tried to pass in an argument, my cluster, without a flag, and our redesign of the CLI requires each argument to have a flag, like -- cluster, my cluster. For good measure, the message also returns the help output of the command that I failed to use, which includes the description, usage, and parameters to help me out. There might also be errors that are not just formatting issues, but are actually a failure. For example, if I pass in a value that is incorrect, such as my cluster, I see a new error message. My cluster could not be found because I do not have a cluster that is called my cluster. I'm also given some tips for how I can find what clusters I do have, such as listing them out, and here I can see what the names of clusters that I do have are so that I could pass in the command and have it succeed. Finally, I wanted to show a fun project that IBM Cloud did to extend the CLI to make it more interactive and visually appealing. We call it CUI, or the Kubernetes User Interface, and it's a bit of a blend between a GUI and a CLI. You use the same commands as you would in a CLI. For example, kubectl get namespaces. We can compare the results to a regular terminal, kubectl get namespaces, and they return the same information, a list of the namespaces. However, CUI adds a little more, like making the status more visual with red, yellow, green bubbles, and adds in interactivity. I can click on these resources, and behind the scenes, it issues more CLI calls to get the specific information about the resource, like the namespace. And now I even get some tabs to go through the different resources within this resource, like the pods within a namespace. For users who are more comfortable in the CLI, but also want to find things a bit easier without going into the, at times, overwhelming console, a project like this could be a delightful experience.